When I was a baby and my brain is soft, I started my Alpha Legion army, and now in 2025, I'm rebuilding my original childhood Alpha Legion army. I started this in a previous video, but this is part 2. I'm gonna be doing one of these videos roughly every month, and today I am customizing Chaos Obliterators. They were always my favorite model back when I was a little kid, and they did not age well. They've recently had an update, and I don't like it. So today, there's gonna be a lot of sculpting as I customize those obliterators and make them into something I love. So now that you know what I'm doing, I really want to make something clear. Designers work really hard and make really cool models, and the obliterator is something that means a lot to me. With that said, the current model, the new version, I waited like 15 years to see what an updated obliterator sculpt would be, and I have to say, I almost love it. The problem I have is the parts I don't like, I hate. I'm going to be sounding really critical of a bunch of things. I'm going to be pointing out the stuff I really don't like, but I wanted to say straight up the front, look, it's all personal preference. Take it with a pinch of salt and let me have my little rant. I'm sure some people love these models. It hasn't taken long for me to hit my first hurdle. It's the feet. The very first model in the instructions has these disgusting toed feet. I don't understand it. Okay, so obliterators classically will show some models. They were kind of like Terminators expanded, filled with this obliterator technovirus where the flesh and the metal were fusing into one. My main issue with these models is the flesh and metal fusing is kind of not conveyed very well. It looks a lot to me like armor panels put across a kind of bloated gelatinous blob monster. So he has these big chunky toes. They don't look like they're fused with metal. It just looks like he's wearing greaves and has a weird frog foot thing. It's gross. It makes no sense. I don't like the look of it. He's got big funky toenails. So I'm gonna carve off his feet while I build this, and that's gonna be one of those preliminary areas I start to work on.
So would you say they need to put the grippers away?
Put the grippers away. Save that for OnlyFans or obliterators.
Only Chaos fans.
Yeah, well, I'm a Chaos fan and I want nothing to do with them. So as I start to look at sculpting these models, I think about my inspiration. And really, I've realized that I want to pay homage to the original models and the original art and what I love about it, but bring these models into the 21st century. So that means getting rid of this horrible look that the obliterator is wearing a diaper. I think the biggest problem with this is that the obliterators are meant to be a fusion of flesh and metal. They aren't flesh strapped in metal, or as Nurgle is, flesh exploding from metal. They incorporate technology into their bodies and it becomes one. They're literally a fusion of machine and man. Now, as I started tackling this project, I realized this was gonna take a long time, and it's something that I really want to do properly. I want to bring these videos out roughly once a month. I don't want this to be a series that falls by the wayside. And to do that and also do it the way I want to, I knew it meant committing to sculpting a lot over a long period of time, because sculpting is not something you can do in one big session. I'm relatively amateur at it, but with patience, time, and doing things in layers, I should be able to get a decent result. The first thing on these legs is to lay down the armor panels. This is basically the ceramite armor, and I'm imagining these more as Terminators than Space Marine Centurions. I mix up green stuff and make sure to use sculpting tools to get really nice smooth finishes as best as I can, and then press the edges up to make sure that it's elevated from the plastic underneath. I also use a sculpting tool to carve a few little details into it here in much the same way as Space Marine power armor has, just some random lines and venting ports. At this stage, I know I'm basically making the Loyalist Space Marine, and then I'm going to chaosify it on top. One of the reasons that Murray was happy to hand me these models, aside from the fact that he wasn't ever planning on making them, is that he'd actually used some of their parts for his Helldrake conversion. Specifically on one of them, the butt plate, which meant I had a really cool opportunity to make a perfect one-to-one homage to the old obliterators. So I actually sculpted this butt plate to look exactly like the obliterator ones. It's like two plates of metal, one higher, one lower, and I absolutely love that I got to do this. With the core parts of the armor sculpted, it was time to move move into the recesses and create that undersuit. This will help hide any imperfections in the sculpting and also areas where the plastic is just being carved out, and connect the areas of armor from the original model to the new one. Now we have a very nice looking Loyalist set of pants, but it's time to chaosify them. And to do that, I rolled a thin strip of green stuff between two pieces of greaseproof paper. And this has become my preferred method of rolling out green stuff nice and flat because it peels off the greaseproof paper with very little effort. One of the biggest problems with green stuff sculpting can be pulling and stretching those materials that you make nice and flat. So this is a way to avoid that. Also, if you leave the green stuff for around half an hour, where you minimize your curing time, becomes a lot less sticky, which can make it much easier to work with when you want things to hold their shape a lot better, such as cloaks or belts. I cut these flattened pieces into thin strips and run them around the top sides of the armor. I don't want to go massively over the top here like modern Chaos. I'm more paying homage to the old obliterators, so I just add a couple of Chaos arrows and blend them in with this trim. I then just use my sculpting tool to scuff up the edges because the obliterator's trim on its plastic is quite rough and uneven. With these bits of trim done on the first obliterator, I can move on to the second and do something a bit different. Paying more of an homage to a Terminator on this model, I add a couple of those thigh plates that a lot of Terminators have, the Tacet plates. On these thigh plates, I sculpt a little bit of trim as well, and altogether I'm really happy with how this one's turning out. With the pants sculpted, I then run little strips of green stuff and sculpt it in to look like flesh. This is such a vibe from the classic metal obliterators, this skin just stretching between different components, as if the obliterator isn't quite sure which part of it is going to be metal or flesh at any given time. With these two parts, the Chaos trim and the stretchy flesh, it definitely looks a lot more chaotic. But to give it the final touch, in a few areas, I also add some plastic horns and spikes bursting out of the armor. At this point, it's worth me saying that you might see some things in this video that are a little bit out of order. You see, the easiest way for me to explain the sculpting process is to explain each area in completion, but in reality, obviously I was sculpting some parts simultaneously. That's because of the curing times. I'd work on one part, move on to another, and then leave them both for a day before I could move on and start again. So don't worry about that. If you do see it, I will be explaining everything in the video, but yes, you might see some slight inconsistencies in the order of the footage. And that leads me to the feet. It was actually quite a lot later in the sculpting process when everything was dry that I could attach this obliterator whose feet I had cut off. You see these horrible gorilla grippers? I cannot stand these disgusting funky feet. I don't understand why they look like they do. I used some feet from a Solar Auxilia Light Sentinel that had also been used in a conversion already, and then gluing them on, I used green stuff to basically create that flesh metal all around the feet. Where the model's calf muscle would be, there was these pistons that I'd carved off because they didn't attach to anything, and here I just cut off some pieces of horn from some spare bits and then sculpted them coming out the back of the legs. I just think this helps balance out the bottom part of the miniature. With that done, the legs, pants on both these obliterators are fixed, and I can move on to customizing some of the weapons. One of the things I absolutely love about obliterators in the lore is, well, why they do what they do. So obliterators are mercenaries within the Chaos Space Marines. They're extremely powerful, infected with this thing called the technovirus. And the technovirus is what allows them to fuse metal and flesh. It's a demonic virus, and it's questionable how human the obliterators are. They're kind of demonic, they're kind of human. They're a really weird blend, and I think they're really cool for that. Now, to win obliterators into your fights, which you desperately want because they're incredibly powerful, durable, and bring amazing weaponry to bear, you need to bribe them. And the way you bribe them is by promising them weapons, artifacts, things they want to basically consume and fuse with their body. Because once they've consumed a relic weapon or something really cool, they can basically manifest it again at a later date. It's their personal collection in their tum-tum. So by the measure of trading resources to buy the loyalty of obliterators for single campaigns, I thought, why are these models represented with such mundane equipment? These obliterators and the way they've been sculpted, they have a couple of bolters, they have like a little Reaper chain cannon, plasma cannon, and look, it's cool enough, chaos weaponry, but for my obliterators, for my Alpha Legion, who are meant to be super aligned with Dark Mechanicus, I just want something a little bit more esoteric. So I'm deciding to change a bunch of weapons on my obliterators to make them feel a little bit different from the monopose models. The first weapon is actually not crazy unique, but this is to finish my homage to a Terminator. I am going to be making a Reaper autocannon. Another element on these new obliterator sculpts I'm not in love with is the cables running outside their body. You see, as far as I'm aware in the lore, an obliterator is a flesh metal construct where it's fusion of metal and flesh, they manifest weapons, and the idea of it sort of extruding an external power cable out of itself that then reattaches into itself just seems a bit like weird. It doesn't really feel like what I'm imagining, which is these hands splitting apart and shooting guns out of them, kind of like Akira. So I'm gonna minimize those power cables. My obliterators are a bit further along. So cutting off the flamethrower, I replace it with a Reaper autocannon, an old bit from my old Terminator kit. And then I grab a massive Mauler bolt cannon belt, this huge ammo belt, and fuse it into the arm, cutting away plastic and then using green stuff to make it look like tendrils of flesh are almost holding this chain to the arm, or maybe it's bursting out from within. I think this combination works really well, and we now have this massive chunky arm holding a Reaper chain cannon, and we've gotten rid of some of those weird tendrils. Have you ever wanted dark nautical themed miniatures? I always have, so we made them. The Kindred of the Abyss. It's our current backer kit campaign, and it is live right now. We have hit all but the final stretch goal, and we'd love your help to make it to the end. What started as 3 squads of infantry is now 7 units with an 8th almost on the way if we hit that final stretch goal, as well as lore, art, a PDF explaining them further, and really the development of a whole game world. We're excited to take you on the journey as we develop this game world, so we'd love it if you could get in at the ground level and kind of help us build this thing up. We'll be sharing heaps of Kindred lore in videos to come, as well as more insights into how they're going to operate and what this game we're working on is going to look like. But in the interim, we have an exciting announcement, which is that we are compatible with one-page rules. That's right, the Kindred of the Abyss I have made an army book for, and we are getting official compatibility with one-page rules. So if you like to play Grimdark Future, you can use the Kindred as soon as the campaign's over to start playing games. And not only that, in the future, the Space Bears will be getting some of that action too. And if you missed out on the Space Bears campaign, which was immensely popular, you can get that as an add-on for the Kindred of the Abyss campaign at the lowest price it has been available since its own Kickstarter. There is heaps of reasons to go support us over on BackerKit, so at least check out the campaign. The links are in the description. It is the #1 way to support us right now and help us into the future. We really appreciate it, and we hope you love all the cool new stuff we've been showing off and are excited as this continues to develop. And now back to sculpting. One of the other things I've always not been a fan of with obliterators is their heads. I call them the little head sphincters. The Hellbrutes have them as well. It's just like a little puckering hole in the middle of their body with a little recessed head in it that looks really sad. And I honestly have always felt that Chaos Terminator helms are the perfect match, and these models were no exception. I got rid of the little sphincter heads and I chucked in some Terminator heads into those holes, cutting away a couple of teeth to make room, but overall, I think it's absolutely worth it. This completely changes the feel of obliterators and makes them look even more powerful and chaosy. I love it. It feels like the Chaos Terminator head was born to be inside the obliterator.
What did he say?
Next, on the weapon arm front, I wanted to add a little bit of that esoteric stuff I talked about earlier. So this is going to be a pretty simple swap. What I'm doing is replacing the twin combi bolter, because let's be honest, that is the most boring weapon an obliterator could possibly have, a standard Space Marine rifle in its arm. And I'm replacing that with 2 Tau breaching shotguns. The Dark Mechanicus loves Xenotech, and if it does the job, it does the job. And I imagine the obliterators are so far past any concept of, well, what normal Space Marines think about, that they just want to consume any technology, any weaponry that's powerful and destructive. So to that end, I thought 2 Tau breaching shotguns is a much more appropriate and cool little homage to that I can chuck in the wrist. So I cut the bolters out, replaced them with breaching shotguns, and then just used the same techniques of using green stuff sculpting to kind of blend flesh over the top of it and mix it in with the model. Once again, to make it feel a bit more organic and more than just strips of green stuff, I grabbed some horns and teeth and just prodded them into the front of the wrist, so there's a few more protrusions than just the breaching shotguns. For my last arm conversion, I wanted to go back to relics. And for this arm, I'm gonna use a Volkite weapon. This is a Volkite Sponson, a Volkite Chevriel. I don't know all the Volkite variants. There's like 8 of them. This one's a Sponson weapon for the Kratos tank, I believe. It's a huge Volkite weapon. It looks awesome. And how am I gonna fit this to the arm? Well, the simple answer is I'm gonna cut the arm off at the elbow.
Oh, Dr. Connors.
So you see, the classic obliterators, as I mentioned, had that Akira sense where their flesh is just making a Swiss Army gun out of their wrist. And I want to pay homage to that in these models. I think the fact that they have these chunky Simpsons hands with 3 fingers and a thumb is clearly meant to represent that these are chaosified Centurion suits, but I don't really love that. I like the idea that a Centurion could be an obliterator, but I think obliterators are more than that. Some of them were Space Marines, some of them were Terminators. They were all different things, and they have all got the obliterator virus. So rather than having that robotic Simpson hand, instead I am going for that classic flesh vibe. So I cut the arm off at the elbow and glue on the Volkite. This add-on is going to add a bunch of momentum and really change the pose of this sculpt, but adding it on is going to require heaps of different layers of green stuff. So painstakingly over the course of a week, I would add muscle strips one by one in the morning and at night while the green stuff hardened, basically fusing on the gun to the arm in a way that looked organic and natural, and it kind of had that gross fusion of flesh and metal down pat. But this wouldn't be enough to sell the idea of it being a weaponized arm. So I had a spare hand from a Mutalith Vortex beast, and I cut this up and glued it on the underside of the gun, following the line from the elbow to the wrist and making it look like the gun was spewing forth from the wrist of this model. You have these splayed claw-like hands that I sculpt around the bottom of the Volkite weapon, and you can just imagine the horrible sound of flesh peeling apart as this Volkite gun just manifested out of this obliterator in its arm. This is how I imagine obliterators fighting, so I'm actually really stoked with how I managed to pull this off. The final major areas of conversion is the top part of the first obliterator. This is the one with the Reaper autocannon. And in this space, I wanted to change this chain gun and the belt feed going into the chain gun into some different weapons. I used one of the autocannons from the little Venom crawler that Murray's used a bunch of the parts of, and had that aiming down the line of the Reaper autocannon. Whereas on the left side, I'd created a photon thruster, which is basically a dark matter laser that the Dark Mechanicus used, or the Mechanicum used back in the Horus Heresy, on their Castellax battle automata and more. This one was a photon thruster, the smaller version of that, and it comes on the Thalax kit. There's a Thalax hand that comes sculpted onto the grip, and I had to shave that away first and then file it down to make it smooth. Then I flipped the weapon upside down, carved out the chain gun, and glued it on. This would leave me plenty of space to sculpt flesh around it and fuse it onto the shoulders. I did this in a couple of steps, just blending layers of green stuff on and roughly following the shape of musculature and adding some lines into it where I wanted to add some texture and definition. Once that was blended on, all the weapons were done and I could move to the finishing touches. This involved just adding a few strips of that stretchy flesh that I'd already done on the pants onto some other areas of the model to carry that imagery and motif across the whole model so it wouldn't look out of place. There are a few areas, especially around the arms and shoulders, where the obliterators do have that sense of armor plate on naked man with muscle, and I used the flesh in these areas to try and make it feel more like a fusion. I also added some little rivets which I just cut off and super glued onto the armor and the trim that I'd sculpted down on the legs. With all these elements done, I'm finished with the sculpting and I can move on to painting. Okay, that was kind of a marathon. I've never sculpted like that. I've never spent so long sculpting. I've never sculpted properly. And as an amateur who was learning and just using patience, it was really rewarding. I'm proud of my efforts on these. I think they look really cool and I'm really excited to see how they'll take paint. So I'm aiming to bring these out roughly every month. Sometimes with shorter months like February where I'm going away on a honeymoon for a week, I'm not necessarily going to be able to manage that, but I'm going to try for one a month. With that said, it's taken about 2 to 3 weeks of building and sculpting in steps to get this far with these models. And what that means is, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to paint both. So I'm just going to paint one of these on the channel so you can see how we go. We're going to dive into that and we can get some cool reveals of one painted. Also, another thing I thought was kind of interesting is that I asked, which should I do, the Defiler or the Obliterators? And I'd say about 75% of you said the Defiler, but there was one comment in particular that really stood out to me. And that comment was, do the Defiler last. It's the grand finale. And I realized that they're right. That person's right. So that's why I chose the Obliterators, even though most of you wanted the Defiler first. The Defiler is the grand finale. There can't be anything else. It's going to be the biggest, craziest conversion. It's going to be awesome. So I think the Defiler will be the final video in this series. But for now, let's paint some models, or a model. I think I'm going to paint this one. And in these Alpha Legion project videos, I think it's more important for me to share the unique things about each project rather than just rehashing the same stuff over and over again. So if you want to check out the first video in the series, I go through how I paint them in more detail, but I do want to cover the areas that are unique to this model, which is mostly the Chaos mutated skin. Now, I wanted to do something demonic and alien, but also incorporating the purples of the Alpha Legion's armor. Of course, in my interpretation, this flesh metal is the Obliterator is kind of becoming part of his equipment and part a demon. So effectively, the coloration of the armor goes through the skin as well. To do this, I used heavy blue-gray, which is a extra opaque paint from Vallejo. And then I used a crimson wash to add a little bit of purple and fleshiness into this and highlighted all of these areas up to much closer than white. This pallid paint scheme does need to be defined a little bit from the armor, so I do that with a combination of black lining and then some recess washes, again in crimson, just to create dark areas as it meets the armor, make it feel a little bit separate. And as a fun little nod to my Sakura Tau, I have painted these breaching shotguns as if they were once Sakura guns, but they have started to degrade and shift as the paint that was once on them is melted and digested off as it becomes part of this obliterator. It's a very subtle effect, but I think it's a bit of difference. And the best way to show it to you is to show it to you in reveals. Let's do it. If you'd like to join this scroll of honor, these wonderful people who support Tabletop Time, consider joining our Patreon. The links are in the description. Patreon is the most direct, regular way to support the channel, and there are a bunch of cool perks. Every week I do a behind the scenes video taking you through how our videos are going, what we're planning, and many more little things like that. There's also the monthly mini review, and occasionally we do extended cuts, and we also have an exclusive Discord where we chat with you all. So if these perks sound appealing, go down the link in the description and sign up to the Patreon. Thank you. Well, there you have it, my obliterators, and personally, I think they're awesome. They are just the way I like them. We have pants on them. They look a little bit more akin to how the lore describes them, and the new Esoteric weapons I think suit my style and Task Force Katos's Dark Mechanicus roots really nicely. I hope you're enjoying this process because I've got more to come. And as I said, we're gonna be doing a video roughly every month, so let me know what unit from my childhood army you can't wait to see next. As I said a bit earlier, the Defiler is going to be the final video in the series, but we've got plenty to do, from Cult Marines, the Plague Marines, Noise Marines, and of course a Demon Prince and squads of Terminators. There's heaps of things I can modify and make fit into my Alpha Legion warband. Thank you all for watching, and a final reminder, please back the Backer Kit and support Kindred of the Abyss to help keep this channel going and our development of a new game system and world. It's been fun, can't wait to get started on the next part of the project. See you in the next one.